and we'll get started. So hi, everyone, and welcome to Collective Intellectualities. We have a very exciting episode planned for you. We are welcoming back to the show Michael A. Peters, Distinguished Professor in the Faculty of Education at Beijing Normal University and Emeritus Professor at the University of Illinois. Michael joined us in an episode 11 for an engaging conversation on knowledge socialism and experiments in peer publishing, two topics that are very relevant to today's discussion. And we are also thrilled to welcome several new guests to the show. Petar Jandrić is professor at the Zagreb University of Applied Sciences, Croatia, and visiting professor at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK. Sarah Hayes is professor of higher education policy in the Education Observatory at the University of Wolverhampton. And Derek R. Ford is an assistant professor in educational studies at DePauw University in Indiana. So today we are going to discuss two new books from Springer's Postdigital Science and Education series. The first is Bioinformational Philosophy and Postdigital Knowledge Ecologies, edited by Michael, Petar, and Sarah. The second is Postdigital Ecopedagogies, Genealogies, Contradictions, and Possible Futures, edited by Petar and Derek. So welcome everyone to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody. So we're going to start off. So these two books each address different aspects of the bio-digital and the post-digital in relation to knowledge and politics and ecology. So Petar, you are an editor on both of these books. So we wanted to start with you and ask you how these projects came into being and perhaps just give us a little bit of a background on each of these texts.
Well, thank you so much for having us today, Amy and Alex. I was trained as a physicist and I really never gave much thought to biology. Yet in early 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, I kind of instinctively reacted by inviting the post-digital science and education community to respond to the pandemic. And I'm really proud to say that post-digital science and education is one of the first journals in the world that launched the call, and that such a call resulted in a large collection of very successful articles. So editing and co-authoring some of these articles turned my attention to relationships between biology, information, and society. And soon after, Michael, Sarah, and I published a series of articles in and around biodigitalism and post-digitalism. I felt that we were onto something much bigger than a few articles, so I suggested that the three of us should co-edit a dedicated book. And our interactions, led by Michael, ended up with the title Bioinformational Philosophy and Postdigital Knowledge Ecologies. I still felt that something was missing, notably relationships between these issues and education. And roughly at the same time, Derek and I co-authored a paper titled Postdigital Ecopedagogies, Genealogies, Contradictions, and Possible Futures. And soon after, Derek and I decided to co-edit the book by the same name. So these two books explore the same theme from slightly different perspectives and with different focuses. They're edited by different people and they have different contributors. Yet I see those two books in a way as one large book. This is why we are talking about these two books together, and it also helps, of course, that we are all friends. So Bioinformational Philosophy and Postdigital Knowledge Ecologies presents a cross-disciplinary overview of critical issues at the intersections of biology and information science. And based on theories of bioinformationalism, viral modernity, the post-digital condition, and others, the book explores two interrelated questions. Which new knowledge ecologies are emerging, and which philosophies and research approaches do they require? Post-digital ecopedagogies, genealogies, contradictions, and possible futures conceptualizes ecopedagogies as forms of educational innovation and critique that emerge from, negotiate, debate, produce, resist, and overcome the shifting and expansive post-digital ecosystems of humans, machines, non-human animals, objects, stuff, and other forms of matter. Contemporary post-digital ecosystems are determined by a range of new bioinformational configurations in areas including capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and ontological hierarchies more generally. So post-digital ecopedagogies name a condition, a question, and a call for experimentation to link pedagogical research and practice to challenges of our moment.
So Petar, you actually mentioned in your response, what's really interesting about these two books is that they're conceived within the pandemic. And that flows through, and maybe I can open this up to the rest of the editors with both books. Reading the chapters, reading the introductions, this how pervasive the impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic appears throughout both edited collections. Could you maybe speak a little bit more to its influence in the development and the process of each text, maybe both as editors, and then maybe perhaps for the contributors as well to each collection?
I'm happy to say something first. I think, for me, one of the most interesting things about the initial sort of onset of the pandemic in early 2000 was actually the absence of a kind of radical break that you might expect with normal. There's a lot of talk about, oh, everything's odd or whatever, but actually, like, in academia, things proceeded. I mean, there were obviously radical shifts and disruptions, but like, degrees were conferred, defenses proceeded, publications proceeded, conferences proceeded, recruitment proceeded, department meetings proceeded. And so I think that was, for me, really evidence that we are in an era in which that like the post-digital actually describes, right? And so to me, both as an editor, but also as a contributor to both of these books, it actually sort of like brought home in a very real way that like, oh, this is not just sort of like a theoretical exploration, but this actually, like, only in such a post-digital ecosystem, right, could this intense, like, global, massive disruption not actually be that much of a disruption in many ways. Of course it was in many ways, but in other ways it wasn't. And for me, that was what was the most surprising.
Can I add something to that? Because I think, one of the tasks for this meeting should be to get a clear idea of what biodigitalism means and what post-digitalism means. Now, for me, post-digitalism means quantum technologies. Now, have we moved into the era? Yes, we have, but only just. So when you look at exascale technologies, for instance, exascale quantum supercomputing, well, the California North Ridge laboratory has only just done that, got to the exascale. So, post-digital is exactly right. It names a moment, a historical transition, but we're at a very early stage of it, and it's very difficult to see what its outlines are. Without really looking more deeply at the emerging, let me say, not just the emerging synthesis in science that is going on, but also its political economy consequences. The interlocking boards of directorships between these new companies that are trying to affect some kind of integration between synthetic biology on the one hand and genomic, and genomic science on the other.
Shall I go next? And just add a little bit more thought following up Michael's comments, because for Peter and I, writing about post-digital for a lot of years, felt as if we were writing in critique of the misunderstandings about digital suddenly driving things in education and these kinds of distinctions. But this idea of biodigital coming in, and as Derek was saying about the pandemic sort of almost sweeping through and revealing so many things to us at a pace about where the biological was intermingling with this. I think certainly I wasn't cottoning on to that at all until invited to work with Michael and Petar on the 4 articles, and that became the chapters. And so that really came in for me, that suddenly here we are with biology, information, technology, society, and this convergence that we were writing about was such an important thing for me to notice, partly because it didn't seem to be recognized, as you say, Michael, in the political economy, the neoliberal setup in education. It just seems as if this isn't being noticed. So it felt as if we had a powerful conversation going there that that we weren't quite hearing it in our institutions at all.
Yeah, well, it's a really novel concept. And, when you look at you use search engine to look at biodigitalism, you only come across the three of us who have put a couple of books together and nobody else. And, the reason for that, also the Canada policy unit that did something on it, which was very foresightful, but very much a state-oriented view that cut across a whole bunch of people, including Indigenous people, about concerns around the control of life and life forms. We're talking about synthetic biology. Well, the Indigenous people the Indigenous people in Canada were one of the first to challenge that Canadian view. So I think you're right, actually. But biodigitalism really seems to me to go back a long way, and I think we've got to introduce the next term, nanotechnology, because really it is at the sub-molecule level, at the very, 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 it's the science of the very, very, very small, where these two forces of synthetic biology on the one hand and, and supercomputing come together. And I think, particularly if I can mention just one area here, which is the biomolecular computational models in new computing. We're on the cusp, only on the cusp of that now. And when you look at the financing, which I think that you raised, Sarah, we're only talking about a few $100 billion that are kind of invested in this technology and related technology. So it's not yet the leading edge of the post-industrial economies yet, but it is there and it's working away. And when you compare China and US, you see the huge investment that the Chinese have made in these supercomputing. It's America has been left behind, so the Chinese have more of these centers than the US, and they know that this is strategic, not just strategic development technology, but it's also security. It's to do with military, the military and surveillance and a whole range of other issues here, and recently they moved into the Pacific and they're testing their new drone system for surveillance here, which is utilizing some of this AI technology. So, we're kind of like, we're the advanced guard on even talking about these issues in relation to social science and pedagogy. So I'm really pleased to see that book, the related book, Petar, that you and Derek did, because I think you're absolutely right. We don't really consider the educational aspects of this huge, I want to call it a revolution, but really it's been a long time coming. Quantum physics, we're talking about, the 1920s, 1926, and information theory. Well, that doesn't really appear on the scene until, Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication in 1948. And, convergence for those, well, process convergence had to wait 20 years. So it's kind of like a very tentative and slow process that has speeded up over time. And so I think the pedagogical consequences too will be slow to unfold. They're certainly there, but I think that we're at such an early stage, it's going to take a long time to work out what the detail of this is.
So I'm hearing a bit about the genealogy of biodigitalism and what you're saying. There are these developments that we can point to that are precursors to the moment that we're living in. I'm just trying to think for a broad audience who's never heard this term before. I had certainly never heard this term before reading the book, so I was interested. I mean, in its essence, what I gather is that biodigitalism is the intersection of biology and digital technologies. I mean, at its core, right? And you guys describe this as a new episteme, so the intersection of bios and techne. And I'm hearing a bit about the genealogy. So, I mean, can you kind of break it down in its most basic foundational level, and then maybe talk about some of the technologies that you can point to today, or forms, or particular forms where this intersection is happening, the most critical ones perhaps, and yeah, and the most critical forms where you see this intersection and the consequences. Yeah.
Well, you know, I mentioned to you just a while ago that the revolution has been a long time coming. We had quantum physics discoveries in 1926, right? Then we had information theory by Claude Shannon, 1948. So the integration, you know, we've got three words here really. We're talking about converging technologies. Now that's a very specific kind of material science, you know, development. And then you've got the conceptual element or the theoretical element. And, you know, we've had to wait for a long time for this to happen. But basically, it's not just information technology and biology. We've got to say it's a particular kind of biology. It's biology at the nano level. It's synthetic biology. It's computational biology. And, you know, that's only taken place in the last, you know, let's say 10, 15 years. So we're talking about, in particular, I think, the application of quanta at the level of biology and information, but through the application of supercomputing in particular to synthetic biology. That's what I would say. And you know, that really is still, as I say, when you look at the information on supercomputing at the moment, I've just done a study of that. You know, there are, you know, maybe 12 centers globally that have not yet, are trying to reach this new, from the Petar scale to the exascale, which is 1 billion calculations per second, right? So we haven't got there yet. There's only the laboratory in Northridge, California, that was the first to break it worldwide. So I mean, I think that we are doing a kind of futurology here. You know, that's the big thing. It's coming. There's no doubt it's coming, and there are huge investments in it. But I noticed when I was doing a little bit of work on this, something that I hadn't realized before, that Toffler in the third wave mentioned it back in 2001. But, you know, this was kind of like, you know, the Tofflers were very connected to Newt Gingrich. And they were Republican strategists. They had no political theory of technology. All they saw was a couple of technologies that could be integrated that would lead the US economy. So, you know, in the late 90s, that was a very big moment. And a lot of, you know, that was a point where they got a lot of funding. But so I don't know if that passed. I think we should bear that past in mind, Alex.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that that's very helpful. I mean, you're talking about synthetic biology, computational biology. I think I'm curious as to like what that actually means in physical reality. Like, what are the consequences of the development of these specific technological forms? I mean, you mentioned gene editing in the book as one specific frontier. I mean, I think that's kind of easy for people to understand because that's been a conversation for quite some time in terms of cloning, but also with CRISPR, the idea of designer babies that people talk about in you know, popular media in relation to that technology. But like, what other forms, like what are the emergent applications, is I think what I'm getting at here. That's what I'm curious about. Or are they just unpredictable? I'm not sure. That's what I would want to know.
Okay, I would like to go back into history a bit, and then I'll try to answer your question. So the history is that, according to Craig Venter at least, 20th century was the century of physics, meaning that the majority of breakthroughs, scientific and other social breakthroughs, in the 20th century were deeply connected to physics. Scientifically, we speak about from Einstein's theory of relativity, quantum physics, nuclear weaponry, nuclear technology, the Cold War. But then with the cloning of Dolly the sheep at Edinburgh and with other breakthroughs in biology, sometime at the very, very end of 20th century, biology has surpassed physics. Not only in terms of budgets, and not only in terms of projects, and not only in terms of so on, but biology has surpassed physics in a way in which it has become kind of more important than physics. Biology is where things are happening at the moment. Now, how did this come into being? There are a couple of things that we talk about in the book, and Michael and Sarah and Derek will surely tell you more about it. It's about various convergences. One important convergence is the one between technology and science, or technoscience. The idea that biology used to be a descriptive science, but now with digital technologies, we are able actually to change things, like technology like gene editing, CRISPR, and so on, actually move biology from its traditional role of description and classification to the role of active tinkering with living organisms, which we can now literally take computer code and make it alive, like poof. Which used to be bloody impossible just very, very, very recently. Now, the idea is that with all those kinds of opportunities, biology obviously has taken primacy over physics, again, in terms of budgets and everything else. And then, bang, 20 years later, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And what Michael says, there were so many things happening already, and it's not a new story at all. And all the ingredients were there, but many of us didn't see them. Michael did write about them in 2012 and so on, but I didn't see them personally. It took quite a lot of time in lockdown and quite a serious pandemic, actually, to make me think. I mean, I was trained like a physicist. I was not trained like a biologist. So it took me a lot of time to actually understand all those shifts and to try to look at biology as something that has agency. It has really, really a lot of agency. And now this agency can be applied to various fields. It can be applied to bioeconomy. We wrote about it. It can be applied here. It can be applied there, with huge social impacts as well. So this is where we are really. We are at the intersections between biology, information, and society. This is where things are going. This is where hot stuff is going on at the moment. Although Putin is trying to bring back physics into the equation again, but that's another story. Sorry, Michael.
Can I reply to your question, Alex, by citing a very practical example, which is the National Science Foundation 2022 new project. You can see it on the web. So it is the 2022 program for semiconductor synthetic biology circuits, right? Now, what that really means is they're developing organic or natural computer memory. So they have these biodigital, cell-based storage strategies. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for biomolecular computational models that will enable computer memory to grow biologically on its own as a basis for storage. Because the problem is with digital computers at the moment is they run out of space. They run out of storage space. What the hell do we do with that? With supercomputing, which is a billion calculations per second, well, what do we do with that information? How do we store it? How do we process it? Well, I'm saying here, I read it very carefully. I've just mentioned this to you. The NSF program comprises 5 research themes, right? These are them: developing computational experimental models of biomolecular and cellular-based systems. That's the first one. Addressing fundamental research questions at the interface of biology and semiconductors. Secondly, designing sustainable biomaterials for novel bio-nano hybrid architectures and circuits that test the limits in transient electronics. 4, fabricating hybrid biological semiconductor electronic systems with storage functionalities. And 5, scaling up and characterizing the integrated hybrid synthetic bioelectrical storage systems. So that's what the National Science Foundation are funding today. And, that's the base, you can boil it down to natural computer, and organic computer memory. So I think that's a really clear example, but I think Petar's right. We see the application, not just in information, but also in medicine, in bioeconomy, in agriculture, in plant production, and of course through neuroscience, through in education as well. So and there have been some really good people writing. I think, yeah, Derek, you've written about this as well, haven't you?
So we've had, when you bring it up, so you're telling me that, as I get this correctly, the NSF is saying creating cellular computational storage, trying to find that out. And so some people would hear that and they'd be, that's just science fiction. But what you're saying is that that's reality. This is happening right now. These are the questions that are happening.
This is the cutting edge of the NSF research program.
Right. So I think that brings up some really interesting things that maybe all of you can speak to when we're thinking through the biodigital, but what are the contradictions with that? Because you can have medical, agricultural applications, educational applications, but there's modernization, there's power, there's catastrophic risk with doing these, but also there's possibilities that the biodigital opens up. So maybe if you can speak about where you see these contradictions, and maybe we can even think about it too within an educational sphere.
Well, if I could just comment on perhaps implications and wider societal implications, just from the point of view of who is or isn't included in this kind of knowledge. Because in wider communities around our universities where we have conversations like this that might be taking place inside, we found out during the pandemic how few people are actually on the internet, even down the road from where I live in the UK and globally and different parts of the world where there is simply no capacity to either participate or there is no understanding of the kind of mediation that might be going on between humans and data and the implications of that. So it was just to throw out a few thoughts in terms of inclusion, because we hear, certainly in the UK, a lot about digital inclusion since the pandemic. So, there's efforts for skills and there's efforts for people to be able to get onto the internet. But that's not enough, is it? For people to be able to begin to appreciate the implications. So that for me is one of our problems, contradictions, challenges, if you like.
I mean, I'll just say, I think that really it's a political question, because all of this is completely anti-democratic. I mean, it's not as if we ever voted and discussed as a society, is this the direction in which we should go, And I guess I have a choice not to apply for the NSF grant, but I mean, those determine, right, what research gets funded, what research is possible, what will be. So, I mean, to me, that's the most important thing. And that's really to speak back to the post-digital question, which is not something I really had a hand in shaping, and I find it useful in many ways. But, is it and I think, I mean, Neil Smith talked about this in his Uneven Development, the early 80s, I think, right, 1982. There's never been, Marx and Engels in the German Ideology said there's no such thing as a nature that's separate from the human, right? There's no such thing as that already. And that was in the 1840s they were writing that. The real question is not about, you know, it's not about like, are we gaining mastery over nature or whatever. It's really about like, in what interest do we produce nature? And who makes those decisions, and how are those decisions made? And to me, those are the real challenges and also the real possibilities, because I think when you make those points to people, they're like, oh yeah, you know, like, I mean, I always use the example of the cell phone or the smartphone. Like, that was completely anti-democratic. You know, it's not as if like we ever thought or discussed or like voted upon whether we all want to be walking around like this all the time, you know, but like, here we are all doing it, you know? And so that's, I think, like, you know, as a political organizer, for me, that's kind of like an agitational point to get people to think broadly about the politics of this.
Absolutely right. Sorry, Alex, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that political question is really deeply embedded in processes of capitalist modernization. And I really think about these things through Ulrich Beck. It's very much shaped my thinking in terms of how these processes related to, you know, that have been, that are interlocking and intersecting science, technology, capitalism, you know, that sort of matrix, as it sort of circulates through the global economy, as it operates through ideology and innovation, you know, it produces these unintended consequences, some of which have catastrophic implications. And I think that political question has to grapple with thinking through what these specific technologies, biodigital technologies, how they're integrated within these processes, and then what kind of a political theory or critical philosophy is applicable to understand in the way that Sarah's talking about. I mean, look, I've never heard of biological semiconductors that can store, that are going to be used for like storing data. I mean, that's a pedagogical problem in question. And to engage in politics, I think in the way that Derek is talking about, requires some sort of educational project, which requires some sort of critical philosophy, hence, you know, how these things sort of intersect in your books. And so anyway, this is just what this makes me think about. And so I'll just have you sort of maybe respond, Michael. You seem to be nodding your head a bit. So,
well,
yeah.
well, put it this way. I mean, I think, you know, it is true that we have passed a point of what Kuhn might call ordinary science into revolutionary science. And quantum science is revolutionary, you know, because it puts into question the fact that laws do not operate in classical ways at the very small level. You know, so that whole paradigm on which, you know, philosophy was integrated with, you know, Newton's, you know, and the development of Enlightenment philosophy grew up in the classical world of mechanics. Now we're facing things like indeterminacy, interference, uncertainty, Heisenberg's uncertainty, superposition, entanglement. These are concepts that are very far from classical science. You know, and social science hasn't got on board with it. So, you know, hats off to Petar on, you know, leading this kind of, you know, this move to inform people about what it means. But biodigital philosophy really is really about. It's got two components in my view. One is the analysis and understanding of the way in which critical social science might proceed with a new bunch of concepts, with a quantum bunch of concepts. Because we're not just talking about quantum technologies, as Sarah has been saying. You know, we're talking about, or Derek has been saying, that we're not consulted. You know, democracy and science is kind of like there's a bit of a cleft between them. We're not consulted about you know, the origination of you know, like life-changing new technologies. And these quantum technologies, I think Derek's right, that they have lots of political questions. That's the other part of the biodigital philosophy. It springs out of a kind of an understanding of the at a material level, understanding political economy of the companies. But also, I think I'd add to that one other observation, and that is that politically, it is, I would say, in part, a determining force in the international arena between China on the one hand and the US on the other. And, the problem in the White House has been, my God, look, China's outstripping us and out researching us and doing all this stuff around strategic technologies. And this is surely one of them. It's clear to me, when you do an analysis of the number of supercomputing centers in China versus US, it's clear that China has been leading them, at least for a few years now, as it has been leading them in terms of the production of scientific papers. So these technologies now have become instrumental, really, with governments pouring billions of dollars into them in order to gain some kind of ascendancy. And I think, to understand the nature of international politics, you'd really need to understand the emerging kind of technology wars that we saw initiated with, under Trump.
Yeah.
Sorry, go for it, Derek.
Okay. So, to speak just quickly, I think Michael raises, obviously very important points in terms of the People's Republic of China. And there's the broader political economic context, which is that in 2018, the US Department of Defense explicitly stated that terrorism was no longer a problem. And the problem it was gearing up towards is what they called great power rivalry, which if you read it, it's clear they're preparing for war with China and kind of Russia, right? Russia's, quite less significant in terms of military power and everything than China is. But like that, at least for those of us in the US, that has to be like a very, something that's determining a lot of our thinking is that the US is preparing to go to war against China. And that war is going to be catastrophic, right? So politically, that has to be something that I think personally, we're always organizing against and doing everything we can to prevent. And then that's tied also to the link that you made, Alex, between pedagogy, politics, and philosophy, which is, actually in the Postdigital Ecopedagogies book, I wrote a chapter with some of my students in which we drew upon your work about educational, solutionism. And so, Alex, in learning, Learning for the Future. I'm sorry, the 2018 book. Anyways, talks about solutionism, educational solutionism, in which, social problems are presented as nothing more than technological problems in need of technological fixes. And basically how it shapes our political imaginary, or sort of ideological frameworks in which we understand the world, which isn't a misrepresentation of reality, but a particular representation, right? Basically, right? It's about our senses. How do we sense the world? What do we make sense of? And how do we, what do we do with those sensations? What sense do we make out of them? Why is it that some things make sense and other things don't make sense? And why is it that, my students are always talking about technological progress or advancement. And I'm always like, wait, is that the right word, right? Because is it actually an advancement or is it just something different? Because half the technology, I'm not deep into technology, but every time my app is updated on Spotify, it's actually a pain in the ass and it doesn't do anything for me. It's just trying to get me into their system for longer, but the way that dominates our educational imaginary. So, at least I know at the end of Alex's book, he talks about the need for a new, sort of mass intellectuality that can create a new map, right? Like Jameson's cognitive mapping. And that's something I think is important, because if you read those early articles when he's talking about that, he's talking about the fact that obviously, in this era, right? And this was in 83, 84, right? It's impossible for us to locate ourselves within the totality of global capitalism. And, and importantly, he says, let's do it, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, we just have to understand it'll always be partial and so on and so forth. But then his other thing there is he's saying, like, look at the crisis in the international Marxist movement at the time is that there isn't a map of what the future looks like. You know, the utopian project looks like. He does say actually that Cuba and the Republic of Yugoslavia are exceptions in that, at least in the 1980, I think it's 1983, 1984 one. It's like a book chapter. But anyways, I mean, for me, that's the educational project, right? How can we help others? I mean, we can explain things, and that's very important, right? But how can we help, like, literally experience the sensation that things could be radically different and that they don't need to be this way? And for me, that's the pedagogical sort of task that I'm interested in that can then, like, contribute to that political project.
I think, can I say, you know, when you talk about biodigital plant production, the ability to make synthetic plants, you know, or through gene editing or whatever. Now, the capacity of that technology to create, there's a utopian story there. And part of the utopian story is what sells the technology at the funding level, you know, and even though in America, you know, they are also at the NSF very explicit about the military spin-offs, you know, because if it doesn't have these military spin-offs through, you know, advanced encryption and through a whole bunch of other things, then probably won't get funded. But there is, you know, simultaneously, and this is what is difficult about it, that these are not separate. You know, the utopian element is of bioeconomy. It's sustainable, it's sustainability, our ability to choose synthetic futures. You know, that's hugely utopian, and you know, it's science fact rather than science fiction. You know, so that's the difficulty is that it's enmeshed with the downside, which is that the control of these technologies of plant production might revert to, of course, Monsanto. And we know how Monsanto works. And, you know, and when I wrote that bioinformational technology paper in 2012, I called it bioinformational capitalism, because the main concept there for me was that this was referring to a self-renewable basis for capitalism. It's not based on the old, you know, factors of production. Here is a different kind of economy, one that creates its own basis. Now, that, to me, that's a radical concept, but it's shown that in the capitalist system, particularly the US capitalist system, there are very few controls, and we only get to learn of the ecological consequences years and years later, when all the damage has been done. So, you know, that's got to be part of a critical biodigital philosophy, you know. And, you know, I say biodigital because I think, you know, we're onto it here, you know, as a small group, and there's a real need to look at the NSF as a concrete example of the way in which the US has for years pushed this agenda. You know, and this is the semiconductor, which is a very sensitive political issue between, you know, China and the US. Taiwan produces so many semiconductors for the industry at the moment, you know, to develop one which is cell-based and not silicon-based is a kind of like a very radical move. You know, and that's why they're pushing it in the 2022 research program. You know, it's not the only program, of course, there are many others, but it seemed to me that program systematically addressed the question of the biodigital. And, you know, that's, I think, when we're looking at the philosophy side of it, I agree that, you know, we've got to look at both the political economy and the politics that fall out from that.
But we're asking, right, is whose utopia is being envisioned in this? And to add to Alex's question and to kind of piggyback off of you, Michael, when we're thinking about these educational utopias, also something that's specific I noticed in both books, which was really interesting, is you designate between two different types of utopias. One that maybe is more democratic and the other that is clearly anti-democratic. So I just kind of like to add that into the mix, and maybe we can hear too from Derek with that.
Yeah, just really quickly, the utopia of the NSF as it's currently organized and constructed is the utopia of endless mastery and expansion. Yeah. Expansion out into space colonization, asteroid mining, no matter the consequences on the planet, and regardless of the good intentions of many people who work in that organization and in these research labs, et cetera, et cetera. I just want
and because like how Derek said, when your students say advancements in technology, that comes at a cost, which we clearly see to the environment right now and to people.
But there is another utopia, and I think you mentioned it, and both Petar and Sarah mention it in the book, which is the utopia of open science. You know, particularly coming back to COVID, the way in which people began to share. You know, the Chinese shared the genome of the virus, which permitted work to be done very, very quickly, and you know. And even the major publishers stepped back from their paywalls to permit some progress on, you know, on virus control and virus recognition and so on, and its mutation. And you know, and I think you wrote a paper on that, Petar, right? On how many?
Actually, yeah.
On how many papers had come out in a very short period of time, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about the role of post-digital intellectuals within this development of a different critical utopias, and how actually the question is really whether those things, when they take place. When Derek said that it's a pedagogical problem, that it's an educational problem, I agree with it. But if you go back in time, for instance, being trained as a physicist again, I always remember these days of glory in the Second World War, when all those physicists in the Manhattan Project did their experiments in places like Los Alamos and so on. And actually in 1943, the group of the world's most famous physicists blew up a small atomic reaction not more than 10 or 50 kilometers from the small town where their families have lived. And why did they do that? Because at the time, they didn't really know about radiation. They didn't really know about the consequences of atomic energy. And then things moved on. And then they realized what they did, but politics didn't really realize what they did. So in spite of some people writing warning letters and so on, America did throw 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And then many years after, we had the Cold War. And then only in the 80s, I would say, we had this proper world consensus about the idea that nuclear weapons shouldn't really be used. Expect that there's a certain regulation of nuclear waste, there's regulation of this, there's a regulation of this. So there was first technology, and then there was political regulation, and then at the very end was actually education. Now the thing is, and this sequence is problematic for me, because I think, as Derek said, that it's a pedagogical problem. One of the problems with this pedagogical problem that I have is that pedagogy always comes late. Now the question is, how do we, and Utopia provides us with this opportunity to build pedagogy into the very forefront, into the very beginning, to give pedagogy, to allow pedagogy actually to lead something for once, other than the other way around. And this is why I think that this is where I see because now we have a lot of talk in the European Union about artificial intelligence regulation, for instance. I mean, people have been warning about the perils of artificial intelligence for 20 years. And now, after so many books have been published, after so many examples of problems and whatever created by technologies have been identified, now we are regulating things. So things first happen, and we regulate them after they happen. So the question is, okay, how do we put pedagogy into the discussion and at the forefront of discussion from the beginning? And I think that utopian thinking and utopian way of developing ideas and concepts and so on is one of the rare opportunities in which actually the social sciences can take and the humanities can take the lead and not the other way around.
Just to add to that, Peter, we're in an economically driven society where economy underpins everything, and therefore, certainly in the UK, we are closing down those social science courses, we're closing down those arts and humanities and critical thinking courses where this actually might happen. I mean, at the moment, it's a complete crisis of the places where we might actually do this kind of creative thinking.
One of the ways to do this is through thinking from your books. We're seeing developing post-digital knowledge ecologies that are maybe more horizontal, it's more networked, it's more relational. But I wonder if there's kind of also a tension when we're thinking through academia and biodigitalism, but also what you have to produce according to assumptions right now in academia, right? And you talk about this in your books where you have to publish. And it's very focused on an individual publishing. And we notice this tension. So is this when you're trying to develop more democratic knowledge ecologies in a post-digital manner, where is that tension with biodigitalism where books are the currency of academic production?
Can I say something here? Because, you know, I've been in the publishing business for like 25 years, right? As an editor of EPAT. And I started up, you know, like 10, 12 different journals internationally. Can I say we're in the grip, the vice-like grip of 5 multinational publishers who determine the form and the content to a large degree. You know, their form is an industrial form that we have been taught to be slaves to. And, you know, that's part of a kind of a much greater system that goes into synergies with ranking agencies and with university research boards and so on. So they all buy into it. And, you know, there's little innovation at the level of form. There is plenty, you know, at the level of content, but you know, the owners are still, they are benefiting from COVID. They're benefiting from also advances in publication technologies. They're increasing their share of the academic market. You know, overall, something like maybe 150 to 200 billion dollars a year. 5 publishers control 50% of all social sciences. And the Chinese don't get a look, and so they're looking to do their own thing, you know, so you're getting this kind of split there, you know, particularly in the citation analysis, but it's all distorted. It's distorted. It's distorted by the political economy, by the ownership of it. It is by the ideology of performativity, publish or perish. I'm deeply pessimistic about it. And then on top of that, what we see in terms of new supercomputing technologies, we're seeing an autonomous, authorless science, data-intensive, authorless science beginning. And you see it with now, there are plenty of journals out there that don't have editors. They just do continuous call for papers. And, you know, the people who are doing that are also behind a wall. You don't know who they are or how they do it or what they're doing about it. So I'm deeply pessimistic that anything can come through really in academic publishing. I got to say, I don't know whether you share those that pessimism with me.
I also think there is a value that is going on there between the co-authorship, the editorial work that is so invisible but is so intense. I mean, Peter spends his life doing this, and if you're editing these collections, you're having dialogue constantly with each other. And the section that we put into this book, the Bioinformational book, that gave people resources to work in edited collections in different ways, I thought was incredibly powerful. So I think there is something that people are participating in that they keep coming back to participate more. And the work that Michael does and the work that Peter does and all of you do, I think it multiplies in ways that, it may not be changing the world overnight, but I think there is a very, very powerful dialogue going on there. And I notice it in the exchanges that I'm having with people and their wish to keep participating, despite the metrics, despite the things that are on their head for their careers. They will make the time to work in these ways. And I'm sure that's not answering anything you just asked, Alex, but I just wanted to bring it to the table because it's the lived experience of this that I'm noticing.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on. This has been a really interesting and pleasurable conversation.